May 30th, 1672, Moscow erupted in celebration. The Tsar's new wife had given birth to a healthy new prince, a boy who would fall in love with boats and war and ideas and power, a boy called Peter. It was clear young Pyotr Alexeyevich would make a perfect Tsar. The problem was he wasn't the next in line for the throne. Peter's father, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, sired two families with two different wives. Peter's half-brothers, Fyodor and Ivan, were both ahead of him in the succession. But there was one other member of the family determined to break tradition and seize the crown for herself. Peter's half-sister, Sophia.
She was educated beyond what women had usually been educated, and she was a very smart woman. In fact, she was probably the best choice among all the Romanovs to rule Russia well.
At Tsar Alexei's death, Sophia's brother Fyodor took the throne, only to die soon after. Now Peter's family reached for the crown. With the blessing of the church, Peter's uncles prepared to make the 10-year-old boy the new Tsar. But Sophia had other plans, plans that would leave Peter scarred forever. At Fyodor's funeral, Sophia planted a vicious rumor.
People, see how our brother Tsar Fyodor has suddenly gone from this world? His enemies have disposed of him.
Sophia's rumor hit the Kremlin like a bomb. Elite musketeers in the army, the Streltsy, cried for the blood of Peter's family.
Peter was 10 years old, and he witnessed things that no 10-year-old should ever have witnessed. Having his uncles, many of the family's closest friends, his father's chief of state, having them all dragged out of their chambers, having them thrown onto upturned pikes, and then having their bodies dragged to the center of Red Square and hacked to pieces. For 3 days, Peter and his mother had no idea whether they would live or die.
Peter was spared because he was of the royal blood. He was the Tsar. To kill the legitimate Tsar would have been a terrible sin.
Sophia couldn't kill Peter, so she took power with a cunning compromise. Russia would crown not one Tsar, but two, Peter I and his half-brother Ivan V. But big sister Sophia would be their crown regent and the real power behind the throne, literally.
And there's even a good visual image of this. There's a two-seated throne that was made for the boy co-Tsars, Peter and Ivan, except behind Peter's seat there's a little window. And so Sophia would sit back there and whisper suggestions to the young Peter.
Although Sophia pulled the strings, tradition kept her from wearing the crown.
She was never crowned Tsarina. Russia was not ready for this yet, even though they would have a woman at the helm not far after the death of Peter. But she was still running the scenes as regent while Peter was a young boy.
Having escaped the bloodbath with his life, Peter abandoned the capital. And while Sophia built a power base in the Kremlin, young Peter built his own stronghold from scratch. From childhood, the boy Tsar loved to tinker and build. He sought out craftsmen who taught him to work wood, metal, and stone. As he turned 13, Peter built a wooden fortress in the fields outside Moscow. Then he built an army to attack it, an army of boys, 300 strong.
I think he, in fact, had considerable freedom to do what he wanted, and what he wanted was essentially war games. He gets interested in all manner of military things, and he starts building up a sort of mini play army of sorts.
The sons of nobles and commoners alike were drummed into Peter's ferocious war games. Though the cannonballs were made of leather, the cannon were real. At one skirmish, 24 young soldiers were killed. Peter's games were deadly serious. The boy Tsar was preparing to save his life and his crown. a crown Sophia had begun to treat as her own. Peter's half-sister now claimed the regal title Great Sovereign. She posed for a portrait wearing the Tsar's royal regalia. She entertained foreign dignitaries and negotiated alliances. She used her brother Ivan as her frontman, but she couldn't ignore her half-brother Peter.
Peter, when he was a child, and Sophia, obviously hated each other for political reasons. They were in two different political camps.
By the age of 17, Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov was poised to take power. The boy Tsar had grown into a 6-foot 7-inch giant, backed up by 2 regiments of the finest troops in Russia.
His presence was just overwhelming to people, and in many ways he terrified people with his presence. And then you combine that with his temper, and he was a formidable character.
In 1689, Peter unleashed his temper on Sister Sophia's designs on the crown. In a letter to his half-brother and half-Tsar, Ivan, Peter threw down the gauntlet.
Sovereign brother, the time has come for us to rule the realm entrusted to us by God. It is disgraceful that this shameful person should rule the state in our stead.
August 1689. Rumors that Sophia and the Streltsy were preparing to strike first precipitated a new showdown. And this time, Peter was no longer a helpless child.
When the showdown occurred, practically everyone supported Peter. Even the Streltsy. Some of the regiments wavered, but nonetheless they supported Peter and did not support Sophia.
The great sovereign Sophia's power base evaporated in the face of Tsar Peter's bold gambit. In the end, Peter treated his half-sister like any woman who crossed a Tsar. He banished her from public life and ultimately forced her to take the veil. Sofia Alexeyevna Romanova, the woman who dared to grab the power of the Tsar, would spend the rest of her life as a nun, imprisoned behind convent walls. In the late 17th century, in the kingdom called Muscovy, 2 brothers sat on the throne of the Tsar. The brother Tsars, Ivan V and Peter I, ruled a far-flung empire of isolated villages, cities, and towns, a place where daily life had changed little since the Middle Ages.
In the 17th century, Muscovy was definitely stuck in a medieval time warp, and it seemed backward by any measures. Muscovite Russia had not experienced the Renaissance. It had not experienced the scientific revolution of the 17th century.
Born in a medieval environment, the young Tsar Peter was captivated by everything modern. Anything new, anything from the West, people, ideas, even clothes. In 1696, Peter's half-brother and co-Tsar, Ivan V, died. As Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov assumed sole control of the Russian throne, he declared his lifelong goal:
to break the bonds of the inflexible customs of Muscovy and to lead this country toward a new day, which shall be better than this.
And for Peter, Russia's new day dawned not in the East, but in the West, in Europe.
There was no alternative in the end, because if one was going to survive, you had to westernize, because the alternative to westernizing was essentially to be run over by one's European neighbors.
For Peter, one thing above all symbolized the new Russia he hoped to build: ships, warships, transports, merchant ships. As Tsar, Peter would build his fascination into a navy, a force that would change Russia and the world.
Peter had a passion for all sorts of knowledge, but shipbuilding from a young age was something that just fascinated him. And he learned everything he could possibly learn about shipbuilding.
But as a potential maritime power, Peter's kingdom had one crippling drawback. Russia, the largest nation on Earth, was practically landlocked. In the north, Sweden and Poland held the Baltic coast. In the south, the Ottoman Empire encircled the Black Sea. Peter wanted a seaport for Russia, a window on the world and the West.
He wanted to take Russia out of its Muscovite isolation and backwardness and communicate with the West, communicate with them in terms of technology, in terms of ideas, in terms of exchanging goods. And for that, he needed warm water ports.
At 23, the Tsar set his sights on the Black Sea's warm waters and the Turkish stronghold of Azov. 1695. Peter and his army marched south on Azov. The Tsar posted himself to the front-line artillery.
Peter, from almost day one of the Azov campaign, is seeing action. And that continues for most of his life. He's very much a guy who wants to be where the action is and does not spare himself, is willing to be out there and be in danger.
But even with the warrior Tsar manning the guns, the Turks sent Russia home in defeat. The setback gave Peter a new insight. To capture the naval outpost he craved, first he needed a navy to lead the attack. The Tsar ordered up a fleet of battle galleys. He needed them finished in 5 months. But Russia had never been a naval power. First, they had to build shipyards and train the builders before they could build the ships. Peter himself led the effort.
He was right there hammering nails and building. And it was through him that Russia's first navy was created. Nothing resembling a navy had ever existed before Peter.
Next spring, the untested Russian flotilla cruised down the River Don, Peter himself at the helm of his flagship. He insisted his men not call him Tsar or Admiral, but simply Captain. On land, the Russian army again attacked the Turks at Azov. And from the sea, Peter and his new navy backed the troops with a withering naval bombardment.
Considering that the first campaign had been a failure and had had very serious, heavy losses, the second time was a piece of cake. So in that sense, he starts a pattern of, even though he might fail initially, he still won't give up on his objective. Militarily speaking, he'll come back even stronger, real quick.
A taste of naval power had at last won Russia a port on the Black Sea. But Peter wanted more. He wanted the secrets of the high-tech warships of the great Western navies. And so the Tsar of Russia left his kingdom to seek out the know-how he craved. No Tsar had ever before set foot outside the kingdom. No Tsar had ever even seen Europe. Peter was going to shatter tradition. The winter of 1697, Peter and some 200 nobles, craftsmen, musicians, servants, and a troop of dwarves headed west on a 1.5-year-long European road trip. To escape the tedious burdens of royalty, the Tsar himself often masqueraded as a common sailor.
He wanted to absorb as much knowledge as he possibly could without the trappings of formality and court ritual and all of that. So he wanted to, observe unnoticed. It was kind of difficult to be unnoticed, at his height, but he didn't want to be known as the Tsar. He just wanted to be known as a traveling student.
For a self-taught craftsman, Western Europe offered the ultimate education. He studied printing, iron casting, paper making, even how to render whale blubber. He took classes in surgery and anatomy in Leyden, art in Leipzig, and dentistry in Dresden.
He was kind of a jack of all trades. He had such a passion for life and for experimentation that he not only wanted Russia to build a navy, but he wanted to learn how to be a shipbuilder himself. He wanted not only more Western style, more Western standards of medicine, but he himself practiced dentistry and practiced on some of his unfortunate men. I'm sure that his talents were pretty much limited to pulling out people's teeth, and that was about it.
He was observing an anatomy course in Holland, and they produced a dissected corpse. And all his comrades grew really squeamish when that happened. I mean, they were just repulsed by this, because it was just an unusual thing at the time. And Peter was just mortified at their squeamishness. He was embarrassed and angry. And in retaliation against it, he made every one of them stand up, march down to the table, and take a bite out of the corpse. It was just his way of saying, stop it.
Peter's greatest hunger was for nautical science. In Holland's finest shipyard, he apprenticed himself to a master shipwright. Then, Russia's carpenter Tsar learned how to build a 28-gun frigate from the keel up. But even with a Dutch ship-of-the-line to his credit, Peter wasn't satisfied. The British ruled the seas, so the Tsar headed for England.
He knows the reputation also of the British fleet, and the British very much cultivate that. So they provide a craft for him to sail on the Thames, and although he rams a couple of other vessels while he's learning to pilot this vessel, he does enjoy this, and he, at the end of this, all says that all things being equal, he'd really rather be an admiral in the British Navy than anything else.
The English offered Peter a fine manor house for his stay. The Tsar's host would come to regret the hospitality.
And they tear the place up. They mess up the plantings, the hedge, they shoot up the house.
A few months later, a bill which was presented for damages caused to the house by the Russians. And these damages included paintings on the walls which had shots fired into them, paving stones ripped up, windows smashed, furniture soiled in various ways.
He was, on some levels, a frat boy, in that he would just drink himself silly. And he would, often while he was on tour around Russia, around Western Europe, he would be visiting people's houses, and it just left a wake of destruction behind him.
When the rowdy Russians wore out their welcome in one land, they moved on to the next. July 1698, after 16 months on the road, Peter's entourage was partying in Vienna when an urgent message arrived from Moscow. Emboldened by Tsar Peter's extended absence, reactionary Streltsy regiments were stirring up revolt yet again. Peter's European apprenticeship ended abruptly. The jack-of-all-trades Tsar headed home to assert himself as Russia's unquestioned taskmaster. For 16 months, Tsar Peter I had reveled in the shipyards and palaces of Western Europe. When he returned home in 1698 and compared his realm with the West, Russia's supreme autocrat wasn't happy. His capital, Moscow, struck Peter as primitive and gloomy. Russia's nobility, the boyars, seemed medieval in their long beards and kaftans. The Orthodox Church wielded far too much power at the Tsar's expense. And to top it off, the Streltsy, the army's die-hard conservative musketeers, were in open revolt. Peter resolved to change it all. He dreamed of a new nation, a westernized Russia, an empire inspired by and wedded to Europe, a gilded land of order, progress, and power. He started his revolution with a little barbering.
He was known to rip people's beards right out with his bare hands at the roots, and beards to him were just something that said old barbaric way. It was a tangible way of dragging the nation forward.
The Tsar ordered a complete change of clothes for his noblemen. Boyars caught in the traditional long kaftans of Muscovy had their robes cut short on the spot.
What he's saying to the Russians, certainly to the Russian nobility, is you can't be very Russian anymore. You have to be Europeans. You have to re-educate yourself to act out the life of European gentlemen and gentlewomen.
Peter ruffled feathers all over the place. I mean, what he was proposing radical changes. He wanted to drag Russia literally out of the Dark Ages, kicking and screaming, with the force of his own will.
If his new Russia called for blood sacrifice, the Tsar had no qualms. He saved his greatest wrath for the Streltsy. Russia's reactionary musketeers.
He never really forgave the Streltsy for having murdered so many members of his immediate family, and he sentenced 1,182 members of the Streltsy to execution. And it was widely rumored, and I think it was true, that Peter himself participated in the beheading of many of these Streltsy.
One obsession would shape Peter's entire reign: to create a Russian port on the Baltic coast, a window that would open Peter's kingdom to the world. But in 1700, the Baltic coast belonged to another nation and another bold young king, Charles XII of Sweden. Born and bred a warrior, Sweden's King Charles would make Peter and Russia pay dearly for his Baltic dream. The cost? The blood of thousands and 20 years of war. The duel began late in the year 1700. Peter's army, 40,000 strong, marched on Narva, the Swedes' Baltic stronghold. With only 8,000 men, Charles was outnumbered 5-1. But in a blinding snowstorm, Sweden's warrior king seized the moment.
Now is the time. With the storm at our backs, they will never see how few we are.
The Swedes charged out of the blizzard and completely overwhelmed the Russians.
Peter, who had all these dreams of making Russia a superb military power, met ignominious defeat. His 34,000 soldiers were trounced by Charles's army of 8,000.
Convinced that Russia was a paper tiger, Charles turned west to attack Poland. He would save Tsar Peter for later.
What Narva did to Peter is to convince him that all of the resources of the vast country which was under his control had to be put to serve one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to build Russia into a military power.
Peter seized bells from Russia's churches and melted them down to make cannon. He jacked up taxes to pay for a military buildup. He drafted 45,000 new troops from Russia's peasant families.
The term of service in the Russian army when people are drafted is 25 years. It's considered a death sentence. And when peasants leave the village to go into the army, they're given essentially a wake. They're treated as though they had died and that they're not coming back.
While Charles and the Swedes were distracted in Poland, Peter's army marched for the sea. By 1703, the Russians had carved out a beachhead on the Baltic, along the shores of the Gulf of Finland. On a boggy island, where the river Neva meets the Gulf, Peter the Great staked his claim.
By nature, we are fated here to cut a window through to Europe. Here shall be a town.
He could have settled in the cities of the Baltics, but no, he had to start a brand new city. And this was significant. It was richly symbolic in that he was creating a new Russia, a new Russian empire, and to essentially be able to start from scratch.
May 1703, the Tsar grabbed an axe and began to build the city he christened St. Petersburg. Never a patient man, Peter wanted his new town to rise as fast as possible. He built his own log house in just 3 days. Peter knew Charles and the Swedes would return and try to force Russia out of the Baltic. He wanted fortresses and fighting ships ready to hurl them back. He wanted a city that Russia would never surrender. He ordered it all built, whatever the cost. Peter drafted thousands of workers to build his new city. Peasants, soldiers, even Swedish prisoners. Often without tools, they dug with their hands. In summer, malaria and mud crippled the work. In winter, ice and scurvy took their toll. Laborers died by the thousands. The Russians would say St. Petersburg was built on bones.
The way that Peter forced the creation, the building of St. Petersburg, also illustrates the steps that he was willing to take to bring Russia into the modern period, to wrench Russia into the modern period.
More than a new city, St. Petersburg was the foundation of a new society. To dramatize the transformation of his realm, Peter would erect a gilded showcase just outside the city, Peterhof. With his new summer palace, the Russian Tsar sought to outdo even the glories of Versailles. Peter's goals, his new city, his new nation, were more important than any Russian life. He uprooted his entire court and commanded them to build new homes in his window on the west. He even told them how and where to build.
Peter's city was really his plaything in a way. I mean, like some kings would line up their soldiers and make them march. He did the same thing really with Petersburg and its inhabitants. So the city had a sort of martial character to it from the start.
When Sweden's King Charles heard of Peter's mad rush to build, he scoffed.
Let the Tsar tire himself out with founding new towns. We will keep for ourselves the honor of taking them later.
In 1708, Charles prepared to make good his boast. The battle-tested Swedish army stormed out of Poland and marched for Moscow. Peter answered with fire, a blanket of fire burning everything in the Swedes' path. Wherever Charles attacked, his troops conquered only scorched earth. By the following winter, the mighty Swedish army was trapped deep in Russian territory, hundreds of miles from their supplies, running short of ammunition and food. Peter waited for spring, then sent his rebuilt army, 60,000 strong, to confront Charles's invaders. In July, the Tsar and the King of Sweden faced off outside the Ukrainian town of Poltava. Crippled from wounds, Charles had to be carried onto the battlefield. But even outnumbered nearly 3-1, Sweden's warrior king still ordered his troops to attack. Sweden's first wave hurled the Russians back. Then Peter's artillery opened fire. Russian guns riddled Charles's troops. Russian conscripts drove them back. Peter's new army was simply too big and too well armed. On the killing fields of Poltava, King Charles's reign of glory was drowned in blood and dust. Russia's absolute ruler, Tsar Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov, would become the new master of the Baltic. Russia was at last a great European power. In 1711, Tsar Peter the Great moved Russia's capital to his triumphant city on the Baltic, St. Petersburg. There was just one problem. The Russian people still considered Moscow the capital. But Peter never let public opinion interfere with his grandiose plans. Peter lived life non-stop. He often traveled over 100 miles a day, in an age when most people might never travel that far in a lifetime. The list of his innovations and reforms seems endless. The first Russian newspaper, the first hospital, the first museum, schools for navigation, geography, mathematics, politics, and astronomy, a new navy, a new army, a new capital. Ultimately, Peter outgrew even his crown. Not content with the old Muscovite title and regalia, Peter ordered a new European-style crown. Then he bestowed on himself a new regal title, not Tsar, but Emperor, autocrat of all the Russias. Still, Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov had come of age in the shadows of the Kremlin. He had seen palace intrigue destroy powerful men. Now in his 40s, Peter knew that his life's work might be erased at his death.
He really did, I think, have a very long-term vision, and it was very important to him that what he'd done must not be undone. It must be continued.
To guarantee the survival of his new Russia, Peter needed a loyal, capable successor. But Peter's only son, the Tsarevich Alexei, would prove to be the great man's greatest disappointment.
The two could not have been more different. Peter was this giant of a man. He was energetic, he was decisive, and yet his son was short, he was lazy, he was sluggish, he wasn't as bright as his father. It was really quite a disastrous situation.
He wanted to kind of live a life of luxury and disregarded all the training that was necessary to be Peter's heir, and it bothered Peter to no end.
As Alexei reached manhood, Peter berated his son.
You do not make the least endeavors, and all your pleasure seems to consist in staying idle and lazy.
His father essentially tells him, look, you're either going to do it my way or you're going to have to renounce the throne. There's no other way. You have got to prepare yourself to be the ruler as I tell you to.
If you do not mend, I will deprive you of the succession, as one may cut off a gangrenous limb.
For his part, the Tsarevich begged his father to relieve him from the burden of succession.
I do not think myself fit for government. My memory is weak, my body decayed. I do not aspire to the Russian crown.
While Alexei failed to meet Peter's high expectations, the Tsar had already found someone else who did. A buxom Lithuanian peasant girl, Marfa Skafronska.
She starts life really as a sort of camp follower. She was a beautiful young woman, and one of the Russian generals took a fancy to her. The story then goes that Peter then caught sight of her, and he, of course, as the Tsar, could have anything he wanted, and that he then took her.
As Marfa evolved into the Tsar's closest confidant, the camp follower acquired a respectable society name, Ekaterina, Catherine.
She was the helpmate that he needed. She went with him to battles. She comforted him when he got angry. She produced children for him and gave him the love and the warmth that I think he had been denied probably as a child.
Peter and his peasant queen married first in secret. Later, they remarried before the court. In time, Peter would even crown her Empress of Russia. And in 1715, Catherine gave Peter what he craved most, a new male heir. The birth of a baby half-brother complicated life for Peter's first son, 25-year-old Tsarevich Alexei. As the gulf between the Tsar and his heir widened, Peter issued an ultimatum.
I cannot resolve to let you live on according to your own will. Either strive to render yourself worthy of the succession or become a monk.
Tsar Peter prepared to imprison his son in a monastery. Desperate to live free of his overbearing father, Alexei escaped to the west. But Alexei's sudden flight only helped to convince Peter that his son was part of a plot against the Russian crown. The Tsar's spies tracked Alexei to Austria and lured the Tsarevich back to Russia and doom. Behind the stone walls of St. Petersburg's island fortress, Alexei faced his father's wrathful inquisition.
He was almost immediately confronted with an ultimatum that unless he divulged all his accomplices, he would not get his pardon.
Treason, conspiracy. The Tsarevich confessed to every offense his father could imagine. Alexei named names and accomplices.
He believed that Alexei probably was part of a conspiracy against him. And to find out the truth, he had Alexei tortured with a knout, which is a thick leather whip that it just shreds through skin. And 15 to 25 lashes with the knout were considered standard. Anything over that would cause death. And on the first day alone, Alexei got 25 lashes.
The Tsar showed no tolerance for even the possibility of counter-reform. He sentenced his son to be beaten for 2 brutal days. June 1718. Alexei Petrovich Romanov died behind the fortress walls, condemned to death by his own father, the Tsar.
I honestly don't believe that ultimately Peter wanted Alexis dead. He wanted him alive and being the Alexis which Peter wanted, but which is what Alexis couldn't be.
Barely a year later, the wheel of fate turned on Peter. His young son, Pyotr, the child of his beloved Catherine, died. The Russian Empire now had no male heir, and for Russia's first official emperor, time was running short. On a cold November day in 1724, Peter spotted a vessel foundering in the Baltic. Hands on to the very end, Peter waded into the freezing waters to save the sailors. Soon after, the Tsar fell sick. As he lay dying in January of 1725, Peter took pen and paper and prepared to write his will. In a single generation, Peter the Great had remade Russia. He had transformed his ancient land from an isolated kingdom into a modern global power, the goal a headstrong young man had set some 30 years before.
Peter introduced so much that was new, but in particular, he ended the xenophobia and the religiosity of the old Muscovite way of life, and he ended the isolation of Russia as a country. And I think this is terribly important. He introduced a whole new style of statecraft. Peter saw himself not as being a religious keeper of the status quo, which the Muscovite Tsars were, but as being a secular, hard-working, reforming Tsar capable of creating through force and fiat. And I think these were the ways in which Peter demonstrated himself to be a real revolutionary.
Now, on the brink of death, one last task remained. Peter still had to name an heir to his empire. Yet of 15 children by 2 wives, only 2 daughters survived. On a piece of paper he wrote, "Give it all to..." He died without finishing the sentence, without naming an heir.